Hi, I'm Doyle Bishop with Tulsa Heaters Midstream. Today I want to talk to you about why coils, heater coils, fail. I like to use the analogy that, hey, what could go wrong, right? I've got the fired heater, and inside of the heater I've got a 2200 degree flame. Close to the flame I've got pipes that are carrying a combustible fluid. And by the way, that fluid might be at 1000 psig. And so for starters, you're dealing with the elements there that, hey, some things could go wrong if not done properly. I mean, obviously 2000 degree flame or 2200 degree flame with a carbon steel tube with 1,000 pounds, let's say, natural gas inside of it, I have the ability, or the elements there, to burn a hole into that tube. The natural gas inside of it wants to get out because it's 1,000 pounds, and the flame, it's hot enough to burn a hole. If you do things wrong, bad things can happen. But if you do things right, you'll get 50 years of run life on a coil. A coil should not fail, really, in a gas plant. In a refinery process, they kind of plan for failure because the service conditions are really severe. They're using a high alloy coil, and they know over time they can actually calculate how many hours it is to failure. But in a natural gas plant, the service is pretty tame. You know, I described it as really scary, but if you do things right, it's really tame, and you should have the expectation that my coil should not be replaced every 18 months or even 5 years for that matter. You should get 20 plus years from a coil in a midstream plant or a cryo plant or a frac plant where you've got fired heaters. The two typical services in a plant are regen gas, which is a high pressure, or hot oil. My comments about coil failure would apply to either one. So let's talk about the nuances of a heater and why a coil could fail. So this is a type of heater that we supply. It's called a loosely wound coil. This is the radiant section of the heater, and this is where the highest tube metal temperatures are experienced. And the reason why is, one, hey, the flame's close, but also a heater is counter current flow. The cold fluid comes in here and the hot fluid comes out here. So you can see the hotter the fluid is, the closer it is to the burner. So this is the area, if you're going to have coil failure, it's typically in the radiant section of the heater. So that's where my focus is really going to be. I've seen coil failures in the convection section, but usually for different reasons than high temperature operation. So let's talk about a loosely wound coil. What does that mean? You can see that there's actually gaps or spaces in between this helical coil. Conversely, this is what a tightly wound radiant coil looks like. Obviously that slinky is compressed together. There's no space in between the coil. This effectively forms kind of a combustion chamber so that all the gases have to go down here. In this case, they make the turn and go out the stack. Many times there'll be a convection section here with this type of heater. It's not shown in this picture, but I kind of sketched it in there. So you got a tightly wound and a loosely wound. And you say, what's the big deal? Well, look at this. So here's kind of the big deal. The first thing is API 530, 560 recommend having tube spaces or spacing on tubes where there's gaps in between the radiant coils in a fired heater. And what the gaps do is they allow for radiation to go and reflect off the refractory surface and get to the backside of the tube. If I have a closely wound, let's say if I have a tube in here that's right there, hey, there's all this radiation coming from the flame is imparted on like a 60-degree pie-shaped section of this radiant tube. So it's very intense radiation, high radiant flux, and that can lead to premature coil failure with a tightly wound coil. It doesn't happen every time, because there's some other things I could do, like I could do a tightly wound coil, make the diameter really, really big, and make it really far away from the flame, and I could help myself in that way, and I could end up dodging the bullet. But the best thing to do is to actually space the coil, and I'm not sure why my eraser's not working very well, but I'll just trust you to use your imagination that there's not a coil there. The best thing to do is actually keep it spaced. 2D, which is 2 diameter spacing, allows you to have the radiation uniformly distributed over this coil, the backside included. That's number one, loose spacing. The other thing that you can do on a heater is you can make this flame too close to the coil itself. Think about that. I mean, just from a simple standpoint, if there's a candle here, the closer I get to that candle, the warmer my hand is. The further away I get, the less warm my hand is. It's the same duty, the same heat's coming off of the candle, I just have higher radiation when I'm close. Same thing can happen with a burner and a heater. If I have a really tight diameter, the closer I put that pipe to the fire, the higher the radiant flux is. So spacing and size of this radiant section of the heater is very, very important. In fact, in my experience, typically, this is the major reason why a coil fails, is someone says, hey, let's make this, let's put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. Well, guess what? It falls out of the bottom. Same thing with a heater. If I try to contain this flame, because I have to have that energy going in to get my absorbed duty, if I try to just put my coil tightly around that, and I make this too short as well, guess what? This area of the coil, as this makes the turn, gets way overheated. And typically, if I make things too small, where I see the coil failure is right here, because that flame is still burning as it makes this turn, still have really hot gases that intimately contact this tube area and make this coil fail at the end of that tightly wound coil section. So the rule there, the takeaway there is don't get cheap here, okay? Make that radiant section big. Make it big enough where you don't have high temperature at the end of this turn and you will have a premature coil failure. The last thing that can happen is, especially on a regen heater. A regen heater's up and down, turns on and off 6 times a day, and you guys know that flue gas is very, very humid. I'm burning natural gas. One of the major components is water in the burning process. Well, as this heater turns off, it's full of flue gas, humid flue gas. As it cools off, it drips down and gets caught in, if these coils are tightly wound, they're typically sitting like this and may even be welded. Well, where does that fluid, that dew point, where does it collect? Well, it collects right in here. And as it collects in there, it creates carbonic acid in the condensation process. Carbonic acid will eventually eat through these tubes, and you can have a failure because I've got these tubes tightly wound, welded together, and it just corrodes through that it's the bottom of the coil in this tangential spot where the coil is touching. So the takeaway, make your radiant section big and give yourself 2D spacing on the radiant tubes.